Вітаємо відомого письменника Тімоті Снайдер, автора надзвичайної книги «The Bloodlands» про жорстокі злочини Гітлера і Сталіна.
Mr. Snyder, welcome to Toronto. And my first question is about the general atmosphere and the creative artistic world, and certainly in certain parts of the academic world, it's definitely not okay to be a Nazi, but it's sometimes cool even to be communist. Why did you decide to work upstream in this regard?
Well, first of all, thank you for the compliment. Going against the mainstream is usually a good way to go, at least to start. But I'd like to stress that I didn't write this book really to be against anything. I started out from the very simple premise that what I was concerned with was killing, political killing. And the book started from the observation that most of the political killing, either by the Nazis or by the communists, took place in a relatively short period of time, 1933 to 1945. And in a relatively compact bit of territory, which is what I call the Bloodlands, between the Baltic and Black Seas, between, let's say, Poznań and Smolensk. And this means that on these very divisive political questions about National Socialism or about communism, I'm taking a slightly different view. I'm starting with the people who were killed. And therefore, it's not, at the beginning, it doesn't matter to me how they were killed. I first noticed that so many of them were killed. And then I start to try to explain the policies. And of course, the first policies that kill a large number of people are the Stalinist ones. The first five-year plan and the associated famine in Ukraine, the Great Terror of 1937 and 1938. In the 1930s, Stalin killed far more people than Hitler. But then as the book proceeds, we move to the moment of cooperation between the two of them, and then on to the mass crimes of National Socialism.
Mr. Snyder, we understand now the general premise of your thinking, but what is the approach that you take in the actual book, and the way you present it and the way it's read?
This for me is a book which is about humanity. It's about a tremendous human loss. It's about the loss of these 14 million people, and it's an attempt to explain why they were all killed and how it could be that policy could bring about these deaths and how people could participate in policies which brought about these deaths. So it is a book about the Holodomor, and it's a book about the terror, and it's a book about Katyn, and it's a book about the German starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, and it's a book about the Holocaust. But it's not about those things in isolation. It's about each of them as a stage or as a part of an overall catastrophe. So I'm concerned with Soviet policies, and I'm concerned with German policies. But above all, I'm concerned with the territory where they were at their worst, which is the zone between Berlin and Moscow. Sometimes Soviet policies were more or less independent, sometimes German ones were more or less independent, but sometimes they interacted or in one way influenced each other, and I'm concerned about that too.
Mr. Snyder, in terms of the research that's needed for this book, what kind of archives and where did you find these archives for this preparation of this book?
Yeah, that's a terribly important question. This is a book which could not have been written 20 years ago. And the obvious reason for that is that we have learned so much about the Soviet Union in the last 20 years. We've learned a tremendous amount about the subjects that are important to me in the first chapters, namely the famine in Ukraine and the terror. But interestingly, the opening of the archives in Eastern Europe is tremendously important for understanding Nazi Germany. Why is that? It's because the Germans actually committed almost all of their atrocities in Eastern Europe, in lands that fell behind the Iron Curtain after the war. So when the Iron Curtain falls and researchers begin to penetrate into Eastern Europe, they learn about the Soviet system, but also they learn about the Eastern Front. They learn about German crimes as well. And so a book which is focused in Eastern Europe, as this one is, it needed archival access, not just for the Soviet material, but also for the German. Now, I myself have done a fair amount of archival research, and it appears in this book. But I would stress that no one could do all the archival research for a synthetic book like this. This book depends very much on the work of colleagues, Ukrainian colleagues, but also Polish colleagues, Russian colleagues, German colleagues, West European and American colleagues. We've all made a lot of progress on these individual events. What I was trying to do was bring together what we've learned into an overall account.
Now, in terms of the analysis of the progress of history of the time that you've been studying, is it possible to say that Hitler learned from Stalin? And is it possible also to say, in a parallel way, that if the atrocities of Stalin had been either stopped or let's say didn't happen, that maybe Hitler's actions wouldn't have happened? Is there possibility to make that kind of a conjecture?
Yeah, it's very complicated. Let me start with the first question. Did Hitler learn from Stalin? In the past, when people have tried to make arguments linking Hitler and Stalin, it's usually been in that form, that Stalin came first and therefore Hitler must have learned something. And François Furet, for example, who wrote a wonderful book called Le Passé d'une Illusion, he stresses arguments of that kind. For me, that's actually not very important. I think Hitler may have learned a bit from Stalin and Stalin from Hitler, but the truth is they didn't know very much about each other. So the whole Great Terror, for example, we now understand what it was. But in 1937 and 1938, it looked like a purge of the top ranks of the Communist Party. Even in 1956, after Khrushchev gives the secret speech, it looks like that. But in fact, it was a mass action directed at peasants and workers and national minorities. That's horrible. Stalin carried out the first ethnic mass shootings in interwar Europe, not Hitler. But the thing is, Hitler didn't know that. So Hitler couldn't have learned it from Stalin. What I'm interested in more is our interrelationships which are political and visible. So for example, it's clearly the case that Stalin helps Hitler to begin the Second World War. Hitler wants the war and Stalin doesn't want the war, but the war begins with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the joint invasion of Poland. That leads to terrible things in Poland, but it's also the beginning of the Second World War. So if we think the Second World War is a tragic event full of individual atrocities, we have to remember that it started the way that it started. Also, war itself is a form of interaction. And both sides were fighting this war in terribly brutal ways. The Germans worse, but the Soviets also in terribly brutal ways. And you can see moments in the war where even though they're enemies, the Germans and the Soviets are influencing each other. So for example, every Pole will say, and they're right, that during the Warsaw Uprising, the Soviets encouraged the Poles to resist and then didn't help them while the Germans killed more than 100,000 civilians. Or in Belarus, hundreds of thousands of Belarusian civilians were killed by the Germans, but they were killed partly because Soviet partisans were encouraging an uprising, and the partisans were directly provoking these reprisals. Or if you think of the Gulag, in 41, 42, 43, those are the most lethal years of the Gulag. Why did so many people die? Well, they were there because of Stalin, but they died because of Operation Barbarossa, which disrupted food supplies and logistics. So those people, all of them, are in some way victims of both Hitler and Stalin, and that's the kind of interaction that I'm more concerned with. Your second question, could there be National Socialism without communism? In some broad way, I think the answer is of course not, because fascism, all of the post-war movements of the radical right, they were all anti-communist. They all started with the Bolshevik Revolution. They all copied Lenin in some way, in that they liked the idea of the party state, right? So you can say that fascists and National Socialists learned from Lenin, that's clear. They liked the party state. And then they had the habit of treating their political enemies as being, every enemy to the left is a communist or is associated with the communists. So in that way, the Bolshevik Revolution enables far right-wing politics, and we can't forget that interaction. But I wouldn't want to go any further than that.
Mr. Snyder, going back to the original premise of our conversation, where being Nazi is definitely bad and being communist sometimes considered to be almost cool, what do you think creates this sort of general atmosphere or understanding in today's modern world?
Three things. The first is that the nature of National Socialism and communism are different. National Socialism is the idea that the members of a single race have the right and the duty and the ability not only to control Europe but to dominate the world just because of who they are, and that other races do not have the right to exist. And that's explicit. And there isn't much more content to the idea than that. Whereas communism, although of course it led to terrible destruction, and I would say it involved inherently terrible destruction of classes and peoples who were regarded as being not with the flow of history, it had other things involved in it too. There was the pursuit of social justice. There was the attempt to, at least at certain times, to create racial equality. So I would say that there are differences. I do not equate communism and National Socialism, and that's one reason why other people, I think rightly, don't equate them. Second reason, during the Second World War, the United States and the British were fighting as allies of Stalin against Hitler. And that has a very powerful effect. It makes it very hard for us to think of our ally as being a criminal, which of course he was. When we entered the Second World War, Stalin's regime had killed more people than Hitler's regime at that point. During the war, that changed, and the Germans passed the Soviets. But that's not an easy way for Americans or British or Canadians, for that matter, to remember the war. We don't like to remember that we allied with one tyrant to defeat another. We want a story of good and evil. And because the worst crimes of Stalinism were right before our alliance with Stalin's Soviet Union, those things were blurred out. And it's not just a matter of looking away. Hollywood during the war made films which marginalized or downplayed quite significantly Stalin's crimes. The third reason is that whereas Hitler's Germany was defeated in 1945, Stalin's Soviet Union was victorious, and it continued to exist for another couple generations. And so it had the glory of victory, and also it had the ability to draw in millions of people simply because it continued to exist. And that's a kind of boring explanation, but I think it's very true. Nothing discredits like war. Nothing gives credibility like victory. And the simple fact that the Soviet Union continued for a very long time means that it was able to draw in generations. And there are still people who, were associated with the Communist Party who are with us, whereas people who are associated with National Socialism, for the most part, are not.
Mr. Snyder here, I don't know if this belongs to this topic or not, but we understand right now that during the Yalta Conference, as a result of the fact that the Soviet KGB was extremely good at penetrating American top levels, and they knew everything what the Americans were thinking. Is it possible that there was some pivotal moment that it's Soviet intelligence that in any way suggested or created the fact that the United States fought Germany as opposed to the Soviets? Is there anything in archives?
No.
Nothing like that.
No. I mean, that's a really interesting question, because it gets to why the U.S. did enter the war, which is very different from how we remember entering the war. We remember that we entered the war because we were on the right side, and we wanted to save the peoples of Europe, and especially the Jews. And in fact, the U.S. entered the war for very different reasons, having to do with power concerns, having to do with Japan, and having to do with a felt alliance with Britain. And those motives in 1940-41 are very different from our memories, which is of course true for everyone. That's always the case, that memory is different from history. But no, I don't think that had anything to do with it. The scenario, think about it this way. The scenario for the U.S. entering any war in Europe was fairly remote. It was an isolationist country. Roosevelt had to work very hard to get us to fight any war. The scenario for the U.S. fighting the Soviet Union in the 30s or 40s is totally unthinkable. I'm not sure what would have to happen, but it would have to be something which just defies the imagination.
Mr. Snyder, when we did an interview with director Snor in relation to the movie The Soviet Story, we received some static even from academics at University of Toronto in relation to presenting that story. Do you yourself receive any static in terms of the content and presentation in your book?
I'm concerned with killing policies. And the two regimes are sometimes similar in their killing policies, sometimes they're different. Sometimes they influence each other, and sometimes they don't. The big puzzle which has to be explained is why so much of their killing happened in the lands between. And I think that has something to do with their own plans for development, but also just for the simple fact of geography, that this was an overlapping zone of power. But mine is not a book which equates Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. I certainly don't equate Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Now, that said, there are people who think that if you write any kind of history of the two of them, that means you must be comparing. And if you're comparing, you must be saying the same. So there are people who have that kind of reaction, that instinctive reaction, that I must be doing something wrong. But I don't have that reaction from people who have actually read the book. Interestingly, and I like to think encouragingly, all sorts of people who have all kinds of commitments, ethnic, political, and otherwise, who have read the book like the book. And I like to think that the book allows people who know something about one event, let's say the Holodomor, for example, to find their way into a larger story. I think that's true of people who know something about Ukrainian history. I think it's also true of people who know something about Polish history or Belarusian history, or above all, Jewish history. That's been the way that it's read, that it's taking these events which have been seen as separate and putting them together as much as they can be put together without pushing it too far. That's been the chief reaction so far. So I'm ready for arguments and I'm happy to have them, but the reaction of the book thus far has been remarkably peaceful.